developing assessments that support learning for students and teachers. He's also an incredible leader and mentor who I was lucky enough to work with this past summer. He earned his PhD from our very own University of Colorado Boulder, and we're excited to welcome him back. So Scott, thank you for being here. And now I'm excited to introduce Congressman Jamaal Bowman. Congressman Bowman began his career as a public school crisis intervention teacher, going on to earn his doctorate in education and later founding Cornerstone Academy for Social Action, which he led for a decade. Currently, he serves as the vice chair of the House Committee on Education and Labor. During his tenure, he has introduced legislation to increase flexibility for state testing through the More Teaching, Less Testing Act, as well as supported an increase in accountability for charter schools, and we're excited to hear him present today on Bill HR 1741, which he will introduce. Congressman Bowman, thank you for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. Thank you so much for allowing me to share a few words. I would love to meet you all in person at some point. I have an excuse now to go to Colorado. I'm a big Deion Sanders fan. And so, if I could get to a game and then hang out with y'all, let's definitely make that happen. One slight correction. I'm no longer vice chair of Education and Labor. During my freshman term, I had the honor of serving as vice chair. So now that we're not in the majority, I'm just a regular old member of the Education and Labor Committee, but it's all good. And thank you all for your interest in this particular piece of legislation, and thank you for your interest in work as it relates to public schools. Public schools have been my life and continue to be my life, and what happens with our children will be a part of everything I do for the rest of my life. So to connect with like-minded people is really exciting and really inspiring. And one of the reasons why I ran for Congress is because we need people like us in those spaces, while also working to build a grassroots movement that creates the revolution that we need in public schools. And I don't use that term loosely because I started teaching in 1999, and there was a lot happening in public education at that time. So first of all, I started teaching right after or shortly after the Columbine mass shooting. So I kind of came in with that in the back of my head. And as you all know, those things became consistent in public schools. But then in 2001, No Child Left Behind came with a bunch of bipartisan support. And, we're going to make sure all kids are 100% proficient by, I think, 2015 was the year. We're going to close the achievement gaps. We're going to do all these amazing things. And so in doing so, they implemented the federal government, implemented this annual standardized testing practice and started talking about this thing called charter schools, which at the time I didn't really know much about or understand, but I did kind of it didn't sit well with me for whatever reason, how certain things were going. And particularly, in my first year teaching. So my first year, I taught math in grades K-4. My second year, I was crisis intervention. And my second year, I was a fourth grade teacher. Third year was crisis intervention. But when I was teaching fourth grade, I just remember every single thing we did being about the test at the end of the year. Like, it wasn't about the curriculum we were implementing. It wasn't about quality instructional practices. It wasn't about culturally responsive teaching. It wasn't about the social and emotional learning of our kids. It wasn't about any of that. It was like, okay, this is the test at the end of the year, and let's make sure kids pass that test. So what began to happen with me and many other educators is, okay, your lesson planning, the questions that you asked as it related to text, was all like designed in a way where their brains could be ready to answer the kind of questions that happen at the end of the year. And that never sat well with me. Now, the idea of kids should be literate in grade X, absolutely, of course. Like, we want our kids to be able to read, write, and do well in math and all that stuff by X grade and continue to grow. I have no problem with that. But the way in which we were going about doing it just felt off to me. And I often went back to my own experience as a student. So, when I was a student, we took a standardized test at the end of sixth grade that kind of, determined what our junior high school path was going to be. This is New York City. I'm sure every state and city had their own thing. And so, we would take the test in sixth grade, and then we would go into junior high school, and we were tracked. Right now, that's not a good system either. We don't want to track kids, but I identified the sixth grade piece of it as key because these other, the tests that we started implementing through No Child Left Behind wanted kids to be ready to take a standardized test at third grade. I just remember thinking like, damn, that seems pretty like young, right? Like I was thinking to myself, was I ready to take a standardized test in third grade? I don't know if I was, but by sixth grade, I was one of the highest performers on the standardized test they gave me. So that always felt off. And again, so many other things were happening, not just in our schools, but in our communities. Like, so this idea of reciprocal accountability is something I've always felt in my bones. Like, how are we holding third graders in the South Bronx to the same standard that we're holding third graders in Scarsdale, New York to? Like, that was just crazy to me, especially when you look at the policies that were harmful to areas like the South Bronx. Like, wealthy, mostly white areas didn't go through redlining. They didn't have guns and drugs trafficked into their communities. They weren't victims of mass incarceration and over policing. They didn't have to deal with issues of race in the way many kids in other communities had to deal with. Their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents were educated, quote unquote, formally. And so that was naturally passed down. They had additional resources to get tutoring or take vacations or whatever. So we have like two completely different sets of kids being held to the same standard without the resources that they needed. And so, as time went on, what you all know and what I, began to pay more attention to wasn't just Black and brown kids who would struggle on standardized tests. It was kids of a certain economic status. And whether they were Black, Latino, white, whatever, if they had a lower socioeconomic status, they, struggled on those sorts of exams. And that connected to parents' education level, community, and all these other things. And then I just started learning about the impact of trauma on brain development, the importance of early childhood education, the fact that there's some kids, for whatever reason, who don't do well on the test as they're currently constructed, but do great in other areas. Like they could be chess grandmasters or actors or whatever, but suck on standardized tests. So, throughout my career, I just kind of, dealt with all of this and engaged in all of this. And then I started reading research about how, testing every year is unnecessary. It's wasteful. It's time consuming. And again, it creates a narrow, myopic curriculum that only focuses on what you get on the test at the end of the year. And then I'll close with this. When I started visiting other schools, because when I became a middle school principal, I wanted our kids to, I wanted to create the most amazing school in the history of humankind for my kids, right? And so I would visit other schools that had these great reputations. And, I would go to whether they were like independent schools, public schools, whatever. I just wanted to see what was happening out there. And I noticed that at the highest performing or the highest regarded independent schools, they didn't have any standardized tests at all. And they focused a lot or all on curriculum instruction and diverse learning experiences, because it was always about deeper learning. It was always about exploration, critical thinking, 21st century skills, and the like. And we weren't doing any of that in public schools. Not only were we not doing any of that, we weren't even talking about it. We weren't even trying to get to a place where we can ultimately do that. And so, I became very active in something called the opt-out movement in New York, where we were, informing parents of their right to refuse state tests. And that had a pretty good impact on what was happening here. And because of this and many other things that was happening to our kids, particularly around harm, self-harm, harm in the community, kids from historically marginalized, neglected, and redline communities and what was happening there. And because many elected officials that I had worked with or tried to work with didn't really understand the issue, I ran for office and was able to win. And now we have this bill, more teaching, less testing, which is not the panacea in terms of accountability, but it moves the ball forward in terms of, okay, let's take a fresh look at how we do assessment and accountability in our schools, with fresh eyes and new ideas and everything happening in the world. So I'll stop there, and I know we have some Q&A, which is great.
Yeah.
Again, thank you all for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. It's great to see you again. Kevin and I and a few comrades were hanging out with the Congressman last week on his turf. So it's great that you're here. And we really appreciate it. And actually, you already answered sort of my first question, how you got to this bill, and it's good for people to hear your background. We could talk later maybe about how your background as a crisis intervention officer and a middle school principal prepared you for working in the House of Representatives, but I don't think anything could have prepared you for that. But we want to get to the bill, and I posted it in the chat for those who haven't seen it. And like the Congressman said, this is really a first step. This is not meant to be everything that we want to do and need to do about education. But one of the things that's important for this group to understand is one of the key provisions is the bill is you remove the mandate for yearly student testing of every kid on every standard in every year. You're not saying states can't do that if they want. You're just removing the requirement. And you want to talk a little bit about that, about how you envision the importance of allowing states to make these decisions?
Yeah, I think states need the flexibility to make decisions as it relates to what's best for their state. And I think they need a tremendous amount of district input to make those decisions. It can't be made in isolation. Each district needs to be able to respond to the unique needs of its particular district. So the flexibility there is key. And states and districts have been ahead of the federal government in terms of understanding, wait a minute, maybe we don't need to do this annually. Maybe we can do it in a grade span way, or some form of sampling or matrix sampling or what have you, similar to what happens with the NAEP exam. So that flexibility is key. The other part of this that I'm really excited about and that brought me to this bill has to deal with what I call the magic of pedagogy and the magic of curriculum. And I use the word magic because, I say this all the time, like, I love being in Congress. I love having a platform. I love doing those things. But if I wasn't there, I'll go back to teaching fourth grade. Like, I love teaching, you know what I'm saying? And that's where the magic, it felt like magic to be in a classroom with kids going through the process of curriculum and instruction and formative assessment with real-time feedback every day. And you could almost see the kid get stronger and better in that moment. Like, we went totally away from that, and everything is now about, again, the end of the year test, right? And so, for me, focusing more deeply on quality curriculum, quality instruction, there's so many people doing great work in these areas, I think helps us to nurture and grow more master teachers. And, this bill doesn't do everything, but another part of this is obviously teacher development, right? Like, how we train teachers in the first place to be in our schools and class size and all of that. And so states need the flexibility, districts need a voice in that, a major voice. And in the best case scenario, when districts have a voice, the voice is coming from the people in that district who elected school board members to then have a voice for what happens in the district. As you all know, in places like New York City, I think New Orleans, Philly, We have mayoral control, which is disempowered districts in terms of having a voice in a lot of this stuff. So we want to be a part of beginning the process of bringing everything back to where it should be.
Thank you. And just for folks, if you have questions, I will do my best to get to them. Either put them in the chat or just raise your hand. I have a few more for the Congressman. But Congressman, I'm glad to hear you mention curriculum and of course pedagogy. The bill, and again, this is a first foray, we understand, but way back when, a lot of us are old enough to remember, the federal government funded some really innovative and powerful curriculum programs through National Science Foundation and others, as opposed to states having to work with proprietary vendors to do all this work. Do you see as a next step part of this reciprocity, the federal government supporting more of these efforts, more high quality professional learning models and things like that?
Yes. I see, when I talk about a revolution in public education, again, I'm not using that word loosely. I think we need a fresh look, a fresh data-driven, research-based look at how our schools are designed, how they function, how they operate, what happens within them, and what are we producing in terms of outcomes for kids, communities, and society. I think we need a fresh look at all that. So yes, absolutely, the federal government needs to play a part in that. Now, I'm very, very clear that it has to be, so it's like bottom up ideas and organizing and innovation, and top down sort of guardrails and supports and safeguards. So federal government providing resources, some structures within states so that states and districts can maneuver how they need to maneuver to meet their needs. Also providing additional funding. Funding formulas need to be looked at differently as well, because of historical discrimination. But I just think we need a fresh look at all of it. And my hope, I pray, knock on wood, that all the good people win next year, and we're able to reauthorize ESSA. We have to begin. We are 2 years late, I think, or 3 years late.
Three.
In terms of reauthorizing ESSA. And when we do that, God willing, I am here, and I'm going to be a bulldog, for lack of a better term, to make sure we don't just nibble around the edges in terms of education. We got to look at Title I funding again, IDEA, all of it. Like, we need a fresh look at all of it. We live in a different world today than than the world as it existed when we first created the public school system. So we have to take a different approach.
Yeah, and speaking of that, Congressman, you're speaking to a friendly crowd this morning, but as you know, not surprising to you, even people who would vote with us 95% of the time would have a very different view. People who claim that they support equity and worry about, quote unquote, kids being hidden. That's why we need these state tests, because districts hid them in the past. How do you respond to those critics, like I said, who would vote with us 95% of the time, but are really for this top-down accountability to keep kids and subgroups invisible?
Yeah, so first of all, there's some truth to that in terms of us not doing a good enough job in meeting the needs of kids. The problem, in my opinion, was we just completely blamed like individual teachers for that, or like individual schools, and didn't look at it systemically. So yes, there are kids in classrooms who could be served better and doing better and weren't and aren't. So so we need to do something differently. That something differently is not annual testing. I mean, it's just the research doesn't support that practice as getting us to where we need to get to. So that's number one. Number two, we're not completely getting rid of state tests, right? If states claim they need the data in a standardized format in terms of, fourth graders' reading levels, right? You can still have that. You could do it in fourth grade. You could do it in seventh grade, do it in ninth grade, or whatever grade we pick in high school, they pick in high school, and you'll still have your state data. And hopefully that data is then used to provide proper supports in our public schools. I mean, you can't do one thing and not the other thing, right? So you want to test and you see gaps. Okay, then how are you supporting the learning in a particular environment that you've identified as struggling? How is that happening? The infrastructure, at least in New York, I know every state is different, to support the ongoing growth and learning of kids, it's just not a quality infrastructure in place, if it exists at all. And so that's why I mentioned just a fresh look at the whole thing.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And again, folks have questions, just let me know. I think I'll just go to one here. And Gail asked, what's the receptivity of these ideas? You have, looking at the bill, maybe 15, 20 co-sponsors, and we saw a lot of your comrades last week who were supporting.
Yeah, so I think we have 25 co-sponsors so far, but that number can grow exponentially based on us socializing the bill to my colleagues in Congress.
Right.
I was very pleased with the 20 or 30, and I don't know if Alex is on, she may have the accurate number. It was about 30 offices in that room to hear the briefing you all presented. That's a big number.
That's right.
That means that, like, one way or the other, people are interested in learning more about this issue, so I was very excited and inspired by that. The other thing I want to mention is the issue of testing in and of itself is a bipartisan issue. Republicans don't like being told what to do, you know what I'm saying? So they don't want the federal government to tell them anything. So we could get them on board, from that perspective. And so there's that number 25 can grow exponentially. Obviously, we don't have Joe Neguse yet, so I don't know if anyone here is represented by Joe Neguse. So give him a call.
My daughter works for Joe, so we could work on that one.
Let's work on Joe, and any other Colorado rep. Let's do that. But again, this is a national conversation, so I've been having a lot of these conversations, if I may just present a sidebar. We educators in particular, like you all, you may realize it, but you may not. You have so much political capital and power. I really encourage you all to use it, both in your state, but also nationally. When I ran for office, the secret weapon was, not only was I an educator, but I was a middle school principal. Once people heard that, they were like, oh, it was like,
that's right. You could do anything. That's right.
We need you in Congress, kind of thing, right? But so when professors call, congressional offices or elected officials or like organizations of professors or educators or parents, it really matters. So I really encourage you to help me get more co-sponsors for the bill. Talk to leadership, Leader Jeffries and Catherine Clark and Pete. They all have a tremendous respect for me as an educator and respect for my background and expertise. But they just need to be reminded that there's an army with me that supports these ideas. So just wanted to encourage some lobbying on your part.
That's my call as soon as we're done. We'll get that one done. But actually, I want to ask a question. I know that, as you noted, this is a first foray, and the accountability provisions of this bill were just simply removing the words annual from the current ESEA requirements. But this is right now, and we hope it goes up. It's a 70, $80 billion expenditure just for Title I. So the question people would say, that's a lot of money. If it was any other agency, we'd want some form of accountability. You have a vision for how we can open up the accountability system? Because many of us would argue that it's the accountability system that constrains right now what we could do with assessment.
So yes, I have a vision. It's ever evolving. So it's not fully.
Mine too.
It's not fully baked yet.
Yeah.
But it includes some of what started to be implemented after as part of Race to the Top, which is a better job at teacher observation and feedback, right? So you all know Kim Marshall has like a teacher evaluation system. What was her name? Oh my goodness.
Danielson, Charlotte
Danielson, thank you. I knew that. Charlotte Danielson, she had hers. And I think there are I really like those systems because it gave me language and structure to support my teachers as a principal to be the best they could be as instructors. So I really believe that is a part of it. I believe some form of district assessment of my practices as a principal is a part of it as well. And obviously state as it relates to districts. I think New York City got certain parts of it right because there was also something called a learning environment survey. Have you all seen this?
Yeah.
So some combination of learning environment survey, teacher instruction, principal practices, standardized tests, but even more so than that, how are we supporting learning in classrooms and how are we communicating that to parents, kids, and community? So some form of all of that, I think, is part of it. And then, we have to determine what are the outcomes we're going for, right? Overall, by this grade, by this subject, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is, as you all know, we're not having that conversation in any kind of holistic way. And my hope is to have that conversation in a holistic way. And again, everything I just said is only related to schools. If we are talking about this in schools, but we're still funding wealthier districts at 20 million more than poor districts, then we're not having a serious conversation. So it has to be the reciprocal piece and what's happening in schools.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that. A lot of us have been trying to build more reciprocal systems because, as we know, districts are not just big schools. They do a lot of things and have responsibilities for a lot of things other than
just real quick on that point, right? So I live in Yonkers, New York, and Yonkers, like many cities, are segregated economically and also racially. So right now, there's a lot of development happening in Yonkers. Which again happens as cities seek to, move more money and tax revenue in and all those good things. So I was talking to a lawyer who's also a housing organizer, and she was talking about these communities where this development is happening. And she said something that was just like, it just blew me away. She was like, yeah, we don't have any parks over there. I was like, what do you mean? She was like, there's no parks in that area. Like, there's no park in Southwest Yonkers, right? How do you have a community with children going to school and there are no parks? Like, think about that. Like, I was very privileged growing up, in terms of where my mother was able to live. And this was also based on state law as well. I had Central Park where I grew up. So imagine me having Central Park where I could imagine a new universe every single day of my life as I go through adventures in Central Park. By the way, bordering like 10 museums, right? Museum of Natural History, Museum of Modern Art, that you give a 1 penny donation, you can walk. So I'm growing up with this, and there are kids growing up without parks, without museums, in poverty. And you got to pass the same test as this kid. Oh, that's crazy. That's like not even humane. Common sense tells you it's crazy. And in my opinion, it's inhumane. And because it's rooted in many racist policies historically, it's a manifestation of institutional racism.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. Questions from the audience? I could keep going. I have a lot more. While we're waiting, Congressman, you'll be happy to know that even given the current accountability system, if we take that at face value, my colleagues and I are just completing a study, actually working on it after this, is where we did test out some of these sampling approaches, whether it's shortening the test or even moving to things like every year testing or grade span testing. Given the current accountability, if you take the current accountability at face value, grades band testing is a little challenged, but there are many other scenarios that can work well every other year or every other grade, or certainly shorter testing, as you reference matrix sampling, which is good. So I think we'll have some of these data to support your efforts to say, yeah, we could still do this and do the auditing function we have. So that'll be coming shortly. So
that's awesome. And just one other thing, you mentioned like shorter tests, and New York State is different than other states. I know other states don't do the whole what do you call it? They don't do 3-day testing. So New York was doing like 3-day testing, right? Where like the first day was multiple choice, second day was like short answers, third day was like extended response in grades 3 through 8. It was just like, what are we doing? So I was also arguing like, okay, can we do like 75% less of this? Can we do like a couple multiple choice questions, a short written response, a longer written response, and be done with it? Scan the multiple choice, have teachers grade the written response, give the feedback right away, report it to the state, and like, can we just make this easier? And it's like, no, we got to go through the whole rigmarole of like all the things, and again, without outcomes that we're saying we want. Right. So it's just malpractice.
Yeah, that's so some of us measurement folks, I see Ben and Elena twitching a little bit at that because it's a little hard to do some of that, but it depends what for, right? And so that's the thing we're all pretty clear on. We've been doing the same thing for 23 years and we haven't gotten there. So maybe it's time to try something different.
So it's so crazy. During my administration training, I was trained by Paul Bambrick Santoya of Uncommon Schools.
Okay.
And I actually like Paul. I think he's really smart, and I think he did make an art and science out of preparing kids to pass a standardized test at the end of the year. But what was part of that was interim assessments, right? Throughout the year, every 6 to 8 weeks, you do an interim assessment aligned to the state test. You analyze the data, and then you teach based on the data, and then you do another one. So basically, it's just more testing, right? But like in that system, there was an in-house system of like scanning and scoring and data analysis, which I think is a decent practice, right? The problem is that became like New York City adopted that, right? So right after the pandemic, when we were talking about, what's it called? Learning loss and helping kids to catch up, New York City adopted a mandatory interim assessment system where kids every 6 to 8 weeks take a test on the computer. And it's just like, again, no talk of instruction, no talk of assessment, no talk of instruction curriculum, no planning around that. Like, it's just we're completely lost in terms of this.
Yeah, when you started out there, I thought Lori Shepherd might explode because it sounds like you were talking in favor of interim assessments. But Lori and I have been doing battle for, I think we're about 25 years into these wars, maybe a little longer, with these interim assessment providers, because it is just more of the same with no efficacy research. The research that's there when people put these in it's almost when you look across studies, it's almost a zero effect. And so that's one of the things we've seen as a result of all the testing that you're trying to stop. People are trying to figure out, how do I prepare through the year? And so what do? We give more tests that look like that end of year test and look different than the kind of rich instructional activities you want to see. So I'm glad you're on guard about that. Kyla, who introduced us, is doing a really fascinating study right now of some of this use, hopefully better use in states. But yeah, very glad to hear your appropriate concern about that. That's right. And so Lori asked here, speaking of which, so one of the reasons why the tests, and they don't have to be as long as they are in many cases, especially for the purposes, but the promise of giving a reliable report to parents from the state every year. Can you see, is there a role for will legislators give up on giving those scores, the No Child Left Behind scores every year? Can we give up on that and think about a way to replace that?
Yeah, it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of socializing and engagement on this issue with my colleagues. It just is. I mean, even on education and labor, we spend very little time on K-12 education and what happens in K-12 schools. We talk a lot about higher education, HBCUs, minority serving institutions, higher education, community colleges, workforce development as it relates to community colleges, all of that, which is obviously very important. But we talk very little about K-12 because the thinking is, well, that's a local issue. And sure, but there's a federal policy that threatens your Title I funding if you don't do annual standardized testing. So we have to revisit the conversation, and it's important for us to myself and like-minded members and you all to begin engaging members of Congress now on this, because what happens is when the big money machine comes in, it gets everyone's attention, right? So when Bloomberg or Ed Trust or these bodies that are super pro charter,
that's right,
have been led the way in testing and Gates. Remember this? It was just it was like, damn, like so much money and power. Congress responds to money and power, right? That's another problem with it. So it has to be us engaging, socializing, and I like that we're kind of starting early on it, but we have to continue, because the more we do that, the more likely they are to quote unquote give that up. But I think part of that conversation is, okay, again, the magic of teaching and learning happens in classrooms every day. How are we communicating what happens in classrooms every day to parents and community? How are we doing that?
Right.
That's I think an important conversation to have. Parents, like we would have, we would give kids progress reports before report cards, right? So that parents knew how well kids were doing in alignment, with certain skills and standards. And if a kid was struggling, like there was a expectation that we would be in touch with the parent around a kid struggling, and we would also figure out in-house how to support the child who's struggling.
Right.
So these are the quality practices that lead to student growth and better student outcomes overall.
Yeah, that's great, Congressman. And for people listening, if you haven't had a chance, and I know it was asking you to read a lot first thing in the morning, to read the bill. So it's very clear the bill does not eliminate statewide standardized testing. It just reduces the mandate of annual testing. But Ben Shear, who asked a good question, could you talk about, because you didn't give up on it, you didn't eliminate it, what do you see as the role of end of year state testing? As you conceived it in the bill, or any other way?
Yeah, I mean, it has been and could continue to be like a public-facing document of how kids are doing by subgroup, which is key for many people. So the what was the term you used? The hiding or hidden thing doesn't happen. So it's a public-facing data on where our kids are in certain grades and certain schools, certain districts on this reading assessment or math assessment or what have you. I also want to have more of a conversation around science and STEM and civics as well. And what does that look like? Because I think that's, we got rid of social studies and science and gym because of these assessments. So I think public-facing document that states claim that they need. So I think there's a place for it to do that there. I don't know how well other states do with the reporting, but New York hasn't historically done a good job with reporting, so that parents know, okay, here's the breakdown of where my kid is at the end of fourth grade, like what, where are they proficient? If they're not, why not? We haven't done a good job of that. So that needs to be improved. The other thing I want to say about just standardized tests in general, I think there's a place for standardized tests, right? Like if you're operating machinery or asked to do some very specific skills, I think there's a place for it in those areas. Even literacy. I think there's, we want our kids to be literate, right? The question is, how do we assess that in a valid and reliable way? If they're not there, like, do we expect them all to be there in fourth grade? And if they're not, is the sky falling, or do they need just a little extra instruction to get them where they need to go? I think all of that is at play. But again, this is about like having the conversation with the right people.
Congressman, I know we only have you for a minute or two more, and so here's a good question for you to take you back to your roots. But Liz asked, what role do you think, and I happen to read the bill, so I know where it is. What role do you think educators, broadly speaking, and community members should play in developing their state's approach to assessment?
A lot, a big role, a big role. Yeah, the whole third-party assessment creation and selling the states always also rubbed me the wrong way. But I think a big role. I mean, educators should play a big role in all of it, in assessment, curriculum, instruction, in all of it. Now it's, how do we do that? Because it's hard, right? Like listening sessions, feedback. But I think with technology and AI, there's a way to do it in a way that you can get a lot of good feedback and make it work. I don't know how yet, but absolutely yes.
Yeah, that's great. I had a colleague who used to say the insanity of the current system is that the school collects all this information one way, shape, or form, sends it to the state, and the state tells them how they're doing, as opposed to the school collecting information, figuring out how they're doing, and then telling the state if the state wants to audit. And I think that's what your bill moves that way.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know who's doing that research, but I want to know more how to do that. Like, school communicates to the state. Yeah. Now, obviously, there's always questions around the subjectivity or the objectivity of that reporting, right? Which is why we have standardized tests, because it's supposed to be an objective measure of how well students are doing X, Y, Z. But that is intriguing to me, how we might do that. Report to district, report to state. And again, support and nurture and train teachers and educators in how to do that work in the most objective way. Yeah, something to figure out.
Yeah. So, Congressman, I know you need to tell us what we could do to help you, and we are eager to help.
Call your member of Congress and ask them to support this bill. Call colleagues in other states, ask them to call their members of Congress to support the bill. Let's facilitate some form of ongoing engagement around not just this bill, but the revolution in our public schools. And let's figure out how to bring all stakeholders to the table in order to make that happen. Parents, community members, students, and obviously educators. That's going to be key, because it's very distressing to be in Congress and the leading employer in the country is the Department of Defense, and the second leading employer is the Department of Justice. And we spend a lot of money on the military, and we spend a lot of money on jails, but not enough on education. Right. So, and then you have states, as you all know, where teachers do not earn a living wage. That's why we have the American Teacher Act, where we're trying to start all teachers at $60,000 a year. As a base salary, and then we got the right to work issues and all of this. So there's just a lot of fighting we need to do. So those are just some initial ideas, but let's just please keep fighting, because I promise you, we don't have the answers in Congress. If you wait for us to come up with a plan for this, it is not going to happen, and it's not going to be a plan that you all support, because it's not going to be grounded in the right things. Waiting for us is pretty much saying, okay, we'll wait for Ed Trust and and Democrats for education reform to do it, because those are the people who have the political relationships that will lead in reauthorizing ESSA. So when I ask you to contact your members of Congress, elected officials, and to fight, is fighting against that, and we'll fight with y'all. We love y'all because we love all people, but we can't have another 100 years or 10 years, 50 years of harming kids. Like I believe, I mean, I'm biased, but I believe like education is the foundational issue of every other issue. And so if we get this right, it'll support criminal justice reform. It'll support universal health care, support housing as a human right. It'll greatly lower cost and waste. It'll grow our GDP for the people who measure that. It'll support the increase in overall health and well-being and joy and happiness in the world. Like, I just believe education is the foundation of it all. And so, but it got to be us, like, leading these conversations. So just please keep connecting with my colleagues and keep fighting.
Yeah, Congressman, can't thank you. We're thrilled to have a true educator leading this from the inside. And as a dad of a staffer, I'm compelled to say this, that you have a terrific staffer helping you that many of us are engaged with, Alex Foley. And so she's been really helpful. And so we do have a conduit to the congressman and the staff. So but I know that many demands on your time on a Saturday morning. And so we really appreciate you taking the time to be here. Let's all give the congressman a round of applause and keep engaged with him.
Thank you. Yes, I was yelling at Alex yesterday. I was like, damn, we got to do this on a Saturday morning. But we made it work. I asked if it was okay to wear a t-shirt. She said yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
This is Mind Builders.
Yeah.
I think the name says it all. It's a great small independent school, because they have to be independent because they can't do this in public schools, where they focus mostly on creativity in the arts. And it's super awesome. And so thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
We'll work on those CU tickets. We'll work on the prime tickets.
Thank you. See you all soon.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Kyla, leave it to you for directions here.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for joining. So instructions are to return to the main Zoom link for all of the NEPC Fellows. So you should have that link in an email from Kate Somerville. And I will see you all back there. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Nice job, Kyla. So I'm going to just hop in briefly, but then I'm going to probably go back to my day.
Okay, that sounds great. Thanks, guys.